Ben, thanks for having me, and Frank as well. It's always an honor to speak to this group. It's great to see so many friendly faces. I was here a few months ago and talked at that point a little bit about just the overall budget situation. I think it was this summer. We talked about some of the history of how we got to where we are today. And I won't rehash that completely, but I would like to just remind ourselves briefly before we get into today's fight. 2011 was when the Budget Control Act was established. That summer was the summer after Osama bin Laden had been killed. The world seemed to be a relatively safe and friendly place. National debt and unemployment were the two driving concerns in the public. That led to this Budget Control Act, which was intended to reduce the debt over a period of time, which we can argue it's a separate conversation about how effective that has been, but the net result when it comes to national security is a 15% cut in national security funding over 4 years in real inflation-adjusted dollars, without counting overseas contingency operations. So without counting the fight, without counting the drawdown in Afghanistan. If you include those numbers, it's actually a 25% cut in national defense in 4 years. So obviously, that magnitude of cut begins to have an impact on the world, or at least on our ability to influence the world. It has an impact on troops. Some of the more high-profile stories that have gotten attention are, the dramatic reduction in the Army size, going from 570,000 down to 450,000 by the end of 2017 or beginning of 2018. Reductions, the Air Force obviously trying to do some things to save money, like retire the A-10. The Navy is struggling along for the first time. It's not completely budget-related, but it's partially budget-related. The Navy won't have an aircraft carrier in the Middle East later this fall for a few months. These are all anecdotes, and there are more sophisticated understandings of each of these issues, but put together, I think it paints a relatively accurate picture about the simple fact that if you reduce the funding for national defense, you'll get a smaller military. A smaller military reduces the president's options, reduces our country's ability to protect ourselves. So, let's fast forward to where we are today. Earlier this year, seeing the situation in the world has obviously deteriorated since 2011. President Obama proposed a modest increase to defense spending, roughly 6%. The House and the Senate eventually kind of worked their way around to supporting this increase. The president, however, also proposed a roughly equivalent increase to non-defense discretionary spending. So this includes things like the Department of Labor, the Department of Commerce, the EPA, Department of Treasury. Housing and Urban Development is one of the big winners in his proposed budget. So he added $38 billion for defense and $37 billion for non-defense. That was his proposal. Congress decided, well, we agree with you on defense, we don't agree with you on non-defense. We think non-defense is roughly okay, and we should probably just keep it there for the time being. So as Congress started working on the defense bills, both the defense authorization bill, which is what we'll mostly talk about here in a minute, and the defense appropriations bills, the president has been, and the White House have been very clear that they think that defense should only be increased if non-defense is also increased. And I think that's the core issue underlying all of this, underlying the veto that we'll likely see sometime next week or the week after, is whether we think, whether Americans think, whether Congress thinks it's acceptable to use the defense budget as leverage for non-defense spending. That's the nut of the issue. Congress is using essentially a budget gimmick to get around the Budget Control Act. They're using OCO, Overseas Contingency Operations funding, to increase defense spending without running into the sequestration that would be triggered by if they put the same amount of money into the base budget. It gets really technical. I'm happy to go into it in Q&A, but I'll just leave it at that. They're using a budget gimmick. It's not a gimmick in the worst sense. This is out in the open. The president has to sign this if he wants it in law. Every dollar in that within that OCO funding is assigned to a specific program. This is not a slush fund, but it is a workaround, a workaround the Budget Control Act cap on defense. So that is what the NDAA has done. The Defense Appropriations Bill, meanwhile, has been stuck in the Senate. Senate Democrats have chosen to filibuster that bill to keep it off the president's desk. The NDAA now passed the House, the final version, the conference version, passed the House earlier this week with about 270 votes, passed the Senate yesterday with 70 votes, and it's headed towards the president's desk. These things take a few days to just, it's an almost 2,000-page bill all told, covering everything from, troop pay, whether the A-10 should stay alive, lethal defensive aid for Ukraine, options for Syria, responses to China, things relating to Iran and how we continue to deter them regardless of the horrible Iran deal. So it's a massive bill. It touches all facets of our national security. It takes a few days to just do the paperwork and pull this all together and send it to the president. Once the president receives the bill, he has 10 days, not counting Sundays, per the Constitution, to decide whether to sign or veto the bill. So we're looking anywhere, it's probably, within 5 to 14 days from now, we could see a veto. It's really kind of at the president's discretion once he gets it, when he makes that decision. And is he going to do it on a Friday night over a holiday weekend? Is he going to do it Monday morning and get lots of press out of it? There's obviously a lot of politics in the White House that will inform this decision. The question then becomes what happens after that. I think it's pretty clear. There is the vote in the Senate was veto-proof. The vote in the House was not. There are also rumors, innuendo that a number of these Senate Democrats would be willing to switch their votes to prevent a veto override, but I don't think it's likely to get that far. My understanding, I haven't confirmed this in the Constitution yet, but is that the House that originates the bill has to be the first one to try and override a veto. So that means we'd go to the House first. There aren't the votes in the House. So that means the NDAA will likely, in my opinion, be stuck in limbo for some period of time. The Congress could potentially remove all the OCO funding and essentially cut defense to sequestration levels. I don't think most House members, I don't think most Americans believe that right now, with all the threats we're facing, that this low level of funding is the right thing to do, the best thing to do. I don't think the Congress is likely to go in that direction. If the president's not going to change his position, then we are essentially stuck pending some resolution on the larger budget fight. If there's no resolution, maybe eventually the Congress would come around to cutting OCO, but I think most members kind of anticipate there's going to be some sort of budget negotiations in the next few months, and the NDAA will probably just sit on the sidelines until that's done. That's not a great scenario. I think there are new authorities in the NDAA for the president to respond to a number of things. There's a variety of policies that would be helpful to him and to our troops that are in this bill that he won't have access to, that our military leaders won't have access to until this bill is signed. And I can go into some of those if anyone is interested. But I think it comes back to, let's just look at the big picture again. The president wants to increase his non-defense spending priorities. He wants $500 million for the EPA. He wants about $6 billion for housing and urban development. He wants $1.3 billion for labor. He wants another $1 billion for commerce, $800 million for the Department of Interior. Those are the things that he is explicitly saying those are as important as our defense spending, given the world we're in. I disagree with him, obviously. I don't think those are the same priority. All those agencies I just mentioned already have pretty robust, if not overgrown, budgets. So to hold the defense bill, to use the defense bill as leverage for these non-defense priorities, I think is inappropriate and dangerous for our country. Certainly, it sets a bad example. Let me just talk about one other thing, and then I'll end or turn it over to questions or sit down and drink my Coke. Let's talk about the history real briefly. The NDAA has been signed into law 53 years in a row. This bill would be number 54. There have been 4 previous vetoes of the defense authorization bill. The most recent was George W. Bush in 2008, or 2007, excuse me. It was the FY 2008 bill, and that was largely over a legal issue with whether Iraqi money in U.S. banks would be held at risk. It was essentially a technical issue that the White House didn't realize the consequences of this language. They vetoed it. Congress turned around and sent it back without that provision just a matter of days later. It was not a political fight. It was just kind of a bad staffing between Congress and the White House somewhere. President Clinton vetoed an NDAA, and interestingly, his main reason was a requirement in that NDAA to establish a national ballistic missile defense system. He obviously did not like that. I think conservatives and national security folk meant, but Clinton vetoed that bill. Again, Congress stripped that provision, sent it back. 1988, President Reagan vetoed an NDAA. There, interestingly enough, was also largely about missile defense. It was a Democrat Congress was cutting his SDI program, as well as cutting ballistic missile submarines and ICBM modernization programs. So again, it was a legitimate issue. Again, Congress there essentially removed the offending provision, sent the bill back, and President Reagan signed it. And the first major NDAA veto, our first veto, was President Carter, who vetoed, I believe it was 1979, the NDAA because it added a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, and he was opposed to nuclear-powered aircraft carriers. So he vetoed it, and again, Congress, a few weeks or about a month later, sent a clean NDAA or an NDAA without that provision back to him. So what's the point of all those? Those were all largely, except for the Carter situation, were all divided Congresses, or Congress of one party and White House of another. But all the arguments were substantive policy disagreements. They were about things that were in the bill. They were about things that were actually national debates. Do we need another aircraft carrier? Do we need SDI or missile defense? Except for the Bush, which was largely a technical problem. This situation, I would argue, is completely different. The president is not vetoing or will not veto this bill over Guantanamo Bay, which is one of the issues he opposes, but again, I don't think it's the driving one here, and I can talk to that if anyone is interested. The OCO, the budget gimmickry, it is a gimmick again, but the president's not does not have a stellar record of caring about budget process or financial responsibility, unless in this case it helps him cut defense. So it's clear from his statements, from the White House press secretary, from the statement of administration policy about the NDAA. It says something to the effect of, and I can give you the exact quote, he will not fix defense without fixing non-defense. That's the issue right here. So, and again, that is not fixing non-defense is not something that the NDAA can do. It's outside of its purview. So the president is going to veto the NDAA for something that is not in the bill and is not defense related. I don't think that's a great thing to do. I will stop there and take questions or have a seat.
Justin, thank you. I apologize for being late and missing
Thanks for having
part
me.
of your presentation. I know it was terrific, and I look forward to watching the videotape in due course. I don't think we're going to let you sit down without taking a few questions, though. So, Ben, did you have one?
Yeah, Justin, thanks. That was very useful and helpful. I did have a question. I don't think I heard you comment on Secretary Carter and his support for the president's position on this. I'm wondering if you can help put that into context. Do you think he genuinely supports the president's position on this, or is he, serving at the pleasure of the president and taking the position accordingly?
I think it's definitely, at a minimum, the latter. I think folks on both sides of the aisle like some of the things that Secretary Carter has done. He's seen as kind of a technocrat, in my opinion. but he has zero or very little political capital of his own. So he is not, unlike Secretary Gates or, frankly, even any of the other secretaries, Secretary Hagel, who were a little bit of their own political actor before becoming Secretary of Defense. Carter doesn't have any of that. So his ability to push back against the White House, I think, is minimal. I don't know whether he wants to in this case, but I don't think he has he's not operating from a position of strength politically. And you can see that even this spring, when the House first started moving in this direction, Secretary Carter went out and gave a speech about how defense spending should not be increased unless all these non-defense agencies got their increase as well. This was back in, I think it was April. So I think it's pretty clear that the White House has said this is the position and you better defend it, and he's doing that. What his personal opinions are, I don't know. What might be helpful, though, is that there have been a series of other senior military officers who've said, I don't really care what color the money is. I don't care whether it's from this overseas contingency operation fund or from it's in the base. We need the money to do the mission. The chief of the Army, the new chief of the Army basically said that in his confirmation hearings. The chief of the Army Reserve has said that. Others, plenty of military officers said that behind closed doors. But you do have some who said it in public as well.
I have a question.
Dan, go ahead.
Leader McCarthy just put out a speech that he was.
Did he really? Breaking news, as they say. You heard it here first. Thank you. Dan?
My question is about the actual consequences of the veto. Isn't it extremely inconvenient for the president and for Carter? They are, after all, the ones who have to juggle and do the nuts and bolts. The president isn't going to let up. There's all kinds of things happening in the world. Obviously, the essential armed services role continues, but morale is an issue, and all these things are answerable initially by the administration. So can you say a word about, in all the examples you gave, essentially Congress told them that they didn't want the consequences of not supporting the military.
Mm-hmm.
But in this case, you have a prognosis, and how's the pain likely to be distributed between the administration being extremely uncomfortable and Congress?
I think it's a great question. I think the challenge, or well, let me back up. The veto of the NDAA, a lot of the authorities, a lot of the essential authorities that pay troops, that keep things going, those actually won't be impacted because they're usually carried in a continuing resolution. So we're operating under an appropriations continuing resolution right now that goes through December 11th. That covers most of the things that would cause immediate pain and harm on the military. So even if the NDAA is vetoed, the military paychecks don't stop, things like that. What it does do is it's largely preventing new and improved policies from being implemented. And Congress has kind of shot themselves in the foot here. Congress is, even though it's supposed to be a fiscal year thing, Congress has gotten in the habit of not doing this until November or December usually. So Congress is actually a few months ahead of schedule in getting this to the president's, ahead of their usual schedule, not ahead of what their schedule should be, but they're ahead of their usual schedule. Which only reason that's relevant is that it shows you that the Pentagon is used to operating without a new NDAA for at least a period of time, and they can probably do it again without too many dropped balls and real challenges. I think the real question is the political one. Does the president care about the politics of this, or is he just willing to, drive forward? Or will he and Democrats feel some sort of heat because of, the world's a mess, and he's vetoing a defense bill. That's the simple reality. And lastly, on morale, I haven't served, so I can't speak too far to it, but I do think it starts sending a dangerous message to troops in the field or at sea or where have you, that the president is vetoing defense bills for non-defense reasons. And maybe that doesn't trickle out there too far, but to me that seems like just not something that should be done.
Good. Other questions? Yes, sir.
I don't know. My opinion changes by the day on that. I think it'll be interesting to see what happens with House leadership elections. I think that's going to be a pretty significant piece of what happens. I've heard from the Senate side before the Boehner resignation that there was expectation in senior leadership over there that there was going to be some sort of deal struck, and they were kind of planning for it and starting to talk about it and things like that. But the changes in the House could certainly put that up in the air. So, I mean, my bottom line is I don't know. I mean, I'm trying to figure that out every day, and you probably know more than I do. That one.
I think you're not the only one who's trying to figure it out, needless to say.
There's a question. The president could actually do his holding hostages and still sign the NDAA, because the NDAA is authorization. It seems he's gratuitously attacking the NDAA when he could still veto the defense appropriations bill and hold the same hostage. This seems to be a point that we ought to make, that it is gratuitous, because NDAA has some other useful structural things. It's not an appropriation, though it authorizes one. This is well, it's not surprising because so many other things have happened, but it does seem it's just another step and an unnecessary one.
No, I think you're right. The president doesn't need to veto this to get to a budget deal. Like you said, the appropriations process is so hung up that's still contingent on some sort of deal being struck. He could sign this and move forward to negotiations. I do think that there are people who believe in this town that the president has wanted to veto an NDAA from day one in the office in the White House. He's threatened to veto every NDAA that's come to him, largely over Guantanamo Bay. Those are usually the provisions that get the strongest reaction from him, and there are those similar strong Guantanamo Bay provisions in this bill again. So he's talking about that plus OCO as the two reasons he would veto it. So maybe it's a confluence of enough justification for him to do it. But you're exactly right that he doesn't need to veto this. He could sign it, go into law, get these authorities, get the $50 million for Ukrainian lethal aid, things like that, and still have the same budget fight here in the next few months.
But that assumes there would be a defense appropriations bill.
Yeah.
Is there any reason to believe there actually would be? I mean, there may be other vehicles that he could,
Probably not
veto.
independently. I mean, he would have to either veto an omnibus or something like that. So far, Senate Democrats have held the line in preventing a defense appropriations bill from going anywhere over the same reason. So.
Right.
Yes, sir.
80% of the world's commerce moves by water. In your analysis, what is the optimal number of carrier routes that we need worldwide to make sure that the shipping lanes and that our waterborne commerce and trade can move freely?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I totally agree. I'm a navalist at heart. There's certainly debate about what that right number of the overall Navy should be, and then specifically with carriers. We're at 10 right now. By law, we're supposed to be at 11. We'll get back to 11 next year. And the carrier gap in the Persian Gulf or Arabian Gulf is going to be significant this fall. I think, I'm not an expert on the carrier question specifically. I think most if you look at a series of independent assessments over the last few years, a lot of them have landed in the 350 ship Navy sort of area. The QDR independent panel, the National Defense Panel, Heritage's own Index of Military Strength, which we measure our military against threats and regional challenges. We say 340 to 350 is probably the right number. And then the mix in that, if we're under 300 ships with 11 carriers right now, what exactly that mix is to get to 350. There's a cheap way to get to 350 and a more expensive way to get to 350 and everything in between. What exactly that is probably outside of my depth of knowledge, but there's I think a large, strong Navy is something we absolutely need.
So we're at 11 now, we need maybe 14 or 15 carrier routes?
Well,
Max to the optimal to cover the whole world?
it depends. I mean, it depends on how many carriers you want out in the world. Basically, you need 3 carriers for every one that you have out there, plus plus another 1 or 2 to go through maintenance. So 11 carriers gets you 2 to 3 carriers out doing things. And the problem is we're down at 2 and kind of below because of some other things right now. So if you want, say, 3 carriers, if you want 4 carriers out there doing things, you kind of have to do the math to figure out how many carriers you want. It really depends on operationally, what are you trying to do? Do you want a carrier in the Persian Gulf and the Med and, Western Pacific all at the same time, et cetera, et cetera? So,
The answer is yes. And unfortunately, we don't have that capability, as you know. I'm just thinking, Ben, we're going to have a program on the Trans-Pacific Partnership to answer this question, because they're now describing it as at least 1 carrier worth of diplomacy. We'll
there
see.
you go.
Anybody else quickly? If not, we're going to move on to Ariel. If not, thank you very much, Justin. Great program.